One morning in mid-2018, a hush fell over the factory floor at Mid-Continent Nail Corporation in Poplar Bluff, Missouri. The plant manager had grim news. Dozens of workers were being laid off on the spot as orders for the company's nails abruptly dried up. Shock and confusion rippled through the crew gathered on the assembly line. How could demand for something as essential as nails vanish virtually overnight? The culprit turned out to be an unexpected spike in steel prices after a new 25% tariff on imported steel took effect, driving up the factory's raw material costs and forcing it to raise prices. Mid-Continent's biggest customers found cheaper foreign suppliers and cut their orders, leaving this small-town American factory in crisis. For Mid-Continent Nail, the largest U.S. producer of nails, responsible for half of all nails made in America, the tariff proved an existential threat. The company suddenly had to pay significantly more for the imported steel wire it uses to make nails. To cope, it hiked its prices, hoping customers would understand. Instead, many simply switched to imported nails that weren't subject to the extra duty. In a mere 2 weeks, the factory lost roughly half its orders. Sales eventually plummeted nearly 60%, and the workforce shrank dramatically from about 500 employees down to 300 as layoffs and attrition piled up. A policy meant to revive U.S. metal industries was now pushing this proud American manufacturer to the brink of closure, a scenario few in Poplar Bluff ever imagined. On the factory floor, the impact was heartbreakingly personal. Veteran employees who had spent decades at the plant packed their tools and belongings into cardboard boxes, unsure if they would ever return. Mid-Continent had been one of the town's biggest employers, the second largest in an area of 1,700 people, so each lost job sent shockwaves through families and local businesses. "We are suffering," admitted Chris Pratt, the general manager, describing how the company was losing money every month as a direct result of the tariff. He even lamented that his factory had become an unintended consequence of national trade policy, a casualty of a well-intentioned economic decision. For the folks in Poplar Bluff, the debate over tariffs isn't abstract. It's unfolding in the quieted aisles of their once booming nail plant and the kitchens of workers wondering what tomorrow will bring. This human story of a nail factory in Missouri offers a glimpse into the real-world ripple effects of tariffs. It illustrates how a sweeping trade measure aimed at protecting some industries can unexpectedly upend others, turning lives and local economies upside down. As we turn to a deeper analysis of the economic costs and benefits of tariffs, the experience of Mid-Continent Nail Corporation provides a poignant reminder of what's at stake beyond the statistics and politics. It's a story of families, jobs, and communities caught in the crossfire of economics, a narrative entry point into understanding tariffs' true impact on everyday people. Tariffs are taxes levied on imported goods at a country's border. By raising the cost of foreign products, tariffs aim to protect domestic industries and can also generate government revenue. They were once a primary revenue source for the United States before the income tax in 1914, and remain important in some developing countries. In recent years, tariffs have reemerged as a prominent policy tool. For example, the U.S. imposed wide-ranging tariffs in 2018-2019 after decades of declining trade barriers. This report provides an in-depth, unbiased analysis of the economic costs and benefits of tariffs, focusing on the U.S. economy with global examples. It will cover general economic effects of tariffs, how tariffs affect prices, efficiency, deadweight loss, and inflation. Tariffs versus other taxes, comparing tariffs to income, sales, and corporate taxes in efficiency and economic impact. Potential benefits of tariffs, the infant industry argument, and strategic long-term gains, as in Paul Krugman's economies of scale models. Empirical evidence and case studies including the U.S. trade war, tariffs of the late 2010s, and examples like China's use of tariffs in industrial policy. Throughout, we cite empirical research and historical cases to weigh the costs and benefits objectively. Tables and structured sections are used for clarity. Tariffs operate like a sales tax on imported goods, raising their price in the domestic market. This has several general effects on the economy. Higher prices for consumers. A tariff on an import causes the price of that good and its domestic substitutes to rise by roughly the amount of tax. Domestic producers, now shielded from cheaper foreign competition, can increase their prices up to the level of the taxed import. For example, after a 25% U.S. tariff on steel in 2018, American steel producers quickly raised prices, with one citing that demand came on so fast that we had to raise our prices. Consumers end up paying more for both imported goods and for domestically made alternatives, reducing their real income. Producer gains and production distortions. Domestic firms competing with imported goods benefit from the tariff through increased sales and higher prices. In the steel example, U.S. steel mills saw a surge in orders and could sell at higher prices. However, these gains for protected producers come at the expense of other firms and sectors. Industries that use the tariffed item as an input face higher costs, as in the case of Mid-Continent Nail Corporation. Resources are diverted into the tariff-protected industry steel, in this case, and away from more efficient uses. This misallocation means the economy produces some goods at higher cost domestically rather than importing them more cheaply, a core inefficiency caused by tariffs. Deadweight loss, efficiency loss. Like any tax, a tariff creates a deadweight societal loss. This is lost economic welfare that is not transferred to anyone but rather disappears due to reduced trade and consumption, because voluntary trades that would benefit buyers and sellers are prevented by the tariff's higher price. Overall welfare falls. Economists note that tariffs tend to create more deadweight loss than broad domestic taxes because tariffs are discriminatory, altering the allocation of production between domestic and foreign sources. In essence, tariffs protect higher cost domestic production, so society expends extra resources to make goods that could have been obtained more cheaply through trade. One analysis finds that tariffs are paradigmatic in reducing economic efficiency by precluding mutually beneficial exchanges. The cost of this inefficiency can be substantial. For example, research on the U.S. 2018 tariffs by Amity, Redding, and Weinstein found U.S. consumers and importers paid about $3 billion per month in tariff taxes and suffered an additional $4 billion per month in deadweight loss, a pure loss of output and welfare. In other words, every dollar of tariff revenue came with roughly 50 cents of lost economic efficiency in that episode. Here is a discussion of tariffs' impact. One-time inflationary impact. By raising the prices of affected goods, tariffs can contribute to a higher price level, essentially a one-time inflation in the cost of certain products. Empirical studies of the 2018-2019 U.S. tariffs found a near-complete pass-through of tariffs to import prices, meaning import costs rose essentially dollar for dollar with the tariffs. Many imported consumer goods, from appliances to electronics, became more expensive for Americans. In some cases, prices rose even more than the tariff rate, a phenomenon called overshifting. For instance, a $1 increase in U.S. tariffs on imported solar panels raised final installation prices by $1.34 as domestic suppliers took the opportunity to increase their margins. Higher import prices can feed into consumer price inflation if the goods are a significant part of household consumption. Indeed, U.S. price indexes for tariffed categories like washing machines jumped after tariffs were imposed. However, the overall inflationary effect of tariffs is usually modest if the tariffed goods make up a small share of the economy. Tariffs mainly change relative prices, making imports relatively more expensive rather than fueling ongoing inflation across the board. In the 2018 U.S. trade war case, even though tariffs of 10–25% were placed on hundreds of billions of dollars of imports, those imports were still a fraction of total consumer spending. The result was a noticeable but limited uptick in inflation, essentially a one-time level shift. Over time, some importers and retailers absorbed part of the costs, accepting lower profit margins initially, and others found alternative suppliers in non-tariffed countries to mitigate price increases. In summary, tariffs tend to raise prices in the short term, but unless continually increased or broadened, they do not create sustained inflation like a macroeconomic demand shock would. They do, however, reduce consumers' purchasing power similarly to a sales tax or a price hike, which can dampen real consumption. Retaliation and secondary effects. Although not an intrinsic effect of a single tariff, in practice, tariffs often invite retaliation from trade partners. If country A raises tariffs on country B's exports, country B may respond with its own tariffs. This can escalate into a trade war, multiplying the disruption. Exports can suffer, foreign tariffs hit domestic exporters, and global supply chains may be rerouted. For instance, U.S. exporters of agricultural products faced retaliatory tariffs in 2018–2019, leading to lost sales abroad and requiring government aid to farmers. Tariffs can also induce currency adjustments, e.g., the tariffed country's currency might depreciate, partially offsetting the tariff's impact, but affecting other sectors like exports. Economists note that a tax on imports can indirectly act like a tax on exports in general equilibrium. These broader effects reinforce that while some industries gain from protection, others, especially exporters and import-using industries, are harmed, and the net national effect is usually negative in terms of efficiency and output. In summary, the general economic impact of tariffs includes higher prices for consumers, protective effects for certain domestic producers, and a net efficiency loss due to distorted production and consumption. Tariffs can cause deadweight losses that shrink overall economic welfare. They also risk cascading effects like retaliatory trade barriers and politicized lobbying as companies seek exemptions or higher protection. The short-run benefits, profits, and potentially jobs in protected industries must be weighed against these wider costs on consumers and the economy's allocation of resources. Tariffs are one form of taxation, but it is useful to compare them to sales tax, income tax, and corporate tax. Each form of taxation has different implications for economic efficiency, consumer prices, and who ultimately bears the cost, but all the above lead to deadweight loss. Even considering this, the tariff is among the most distortionary because it applies narrowly to specific foreign products and creates significant deadweight, societal, loss. Consumers forego beneficial imports, and production shifts inefficiently to domestic suppliers who may not be as cost-effective. This reallocation raises the price of both imported and domestically produced goods in the affected sectors. Though foreign exporters may sometimes reduce their prices slightly, the majority of the cost is passed on to domestic consumers and businesses, making tariffs one of the least efficient tax tools. In terms of economic impact, in contrast, a general sales tax or consumption tax, such as a value-added tax (VAT), typically has a broader base and is more efficient. While it can influence when and what people choose to consume, it doesn't distort the choice between domestic and imported goods if applied uniformly. Sales taxes do raise the prices of taxed goods, creating a one-time bump in the price level, but they are not inherently inflationary unless the rate keeps rising. Consumers directly bear the cost at checkout, and the tax tends to be regressive unless exemptions are made for necessities. Personal income taxes levied on individual earnings introduce moderate inefficiencies by potentially discouraging work and savings. However, they don't raise consumer prices directly. Rather, they reduce disposable income, which can actually soften demand and ease inflationary pressures. The burden falls mainly on workers, and progressive structures can shift more of the tax load to higher earners. Lastly, corporate income taxes, applied to company profits, also carry moderate deadweight losses. They may deter investment or encourage tax avoidance strategies like shifting profits abroad. Still, they do not directly raise prices since companies typically set prices based on market forces rather than tax obligations. The true incidence of corporate taxes is debated, but they generally affect shareholders first, with some burden potentially passed to workers or consumers over time in less competitive markets. Tariffs generally rank as a less efficient form of taxation compared to broad-based taxes. The discriminatory nature of a tariff taxing foreign goods, but not the equivalent domestic goods, causes consumers and firms to shift behavior in especially distortionary ways. In fact, economists have pointed out that tariffs create more deadweight loss than many internal taxes for a given amount of revenue. One reason is that part of the cost to consumers from a tariff goes not to the government as revenue, but to domestic producers in the form of higher prices, and another part is simply lost by shrinking the overall volume of trade. For example, U.S. tariff revenue in fiscal year 2024 was about $77 billion, but consumers paid much more than that in higher prices, the difference being the combination of transfers to producers and deadweight losses in consumption. By contrast, a domestic sales or income tax of $77 billion would transfer money to the government, but wouldn't specifically raise the price of one product relative to another or protect higher cost producer. In terms of inflationary impact, a tariff is akin to a sales tax on a subset of goods. It directly makes goods more expensive for end users, which can register as a higher consumer price index (CPI) for those items. Broad sales taxes like a VAT increase similarly cause a one-off rise in the price level. Income and corporate taxes, on the other hand, work through disposable income or profits and do not directly drive consumer prices up. In fact, if one were to replace a broad-based tax with tariffs, it could be more inflationary because the tax burden would shift onto goods prices. For instance, analysts noted that proposals to finance U.S. government revenue with across-the-board tariffs in lieu of, say, income taxes would amount to a noticeable price hike on nearly all imported consumption, effectively a tax visible to consumers at the checkout. Each tax type also has different incidence and equity implications. Tariffs are often considered regressive lower-income households pay a larger share of their income on tariffs, since many essentials like apparel or food can face tariffs, similar to sales taxes. Income taxes can be made progressive. Thus, from a policy perspective, tariffs are usually not the first choice tax for raising revenue in a large, advanced economy. They distort trade and typically provide a relatively small share of revenue, only 1.5% of U.S. federal revenues in 2024. Developing countries may rely more on tariffs due to easier collection at ports, but this can come at the cost of higher consumer prices and inhibited trade growth. Despite their efficiency costs, tariffs can have positive aspects under certain conditions. Economic theory and historical experience provide a few arguments where tariffs or protective trade policies might yield long-term benefits. The classic infant industry argument is that new or developing industries may initially be unable to compete with established foreign producers, but given time and protection, they can grow, learn, and eventually become efficient. Tariffs or other barriers give these industries a temporary shield from international competition during their learning phase. The potential benefits include developing domestic industrial capacity, creating jobs, and eventually establishing globally competitive firms. Economist Paul Krugman's work on strategic trade and new trade theory provides a formal underpinning to this idea. In models with economies of scale and imperfect competition, there can be multiple equilibria in trade. A country that manages to build a large industrial base in a sector can achieve lower costs and dominate global markets. In such cases, temporary protection or subsidies might allow a country's firms to reach the scale needed to compete internationally. New trade theory (NTT) suggests that because of increasing returns to scale and network effects, it's possible for similar countries to specialize in different industries and trade to their mutual benefit. Some proponents of NTT argue that targeted protectionist measures can start an industry so that it later exports and benefits from scale economies. This is essentially a more formal, high-tech version of the infant industry argument that earlier economists had made in less quantitative terms. Historical examples of infant industry protection are numerous. The United States itself, during the 19th century, maintained high tariffs to protect its budding manufacturing industries, e.g., textiles and steel, from European competition. This period coincided with rapid industrialization in the U.S. in the 20th century. Countries like South Korea and Japan used tariffs and import restrictions in the post-WW II era to nurture industry, such as steel, automobiles, and electronics. South Korea, for example, restricted imports of consumer goods and supported domestic keyball firms. Over a few decades, companies like Samsung and Hyundai grew from infancy to world leaders. These East Asian tiger economies coupled tariff protection with aggressive export promotion. Once the infant firms grew stronger, they were pushed to compete in global markets, which further improved their efficiency. This combined strategy of temporary protection plus export discipline is often cited as a key to their success. China is a more recent case often mentioned. During the late 20th and early 21st centuries, China kept relatively high tariffs and tight limits on foreign access in sectors it wished to develop, such as autos, telecommunications, and technology. For instance, imported cars in China faced steep tariffs, 25% for many years, and foreign automakers were forced into joint ventures. This gave Chinese domestic auto firms a chance to develop. Today, China has several competitive car manufacturers, especially in electric vehicles, beginning to export globally, a development some attribute in part to those protective policies in industry's early stage. More generally, China's combination of tariffs, subsidies, and industrial policies helped foster companies like Huawei shielded from foreign competition in the domestic telecom market, and a massive domestic solar panel industry, aided by subsidies until it achieved dominant scale. These examples suggest that when tariffs are used strategically and alongside investments in innovation and skills, they can facilitate the rise of competitive domestic firms. It is important to note, however, that infant industry protection is not guaranteed to succeed. For every South Korea or Japan, there have been cases where protection bred complacency or persistent inefficiency. A well-known example is Brazil's computer industry in the 1980s. Brazil banned or heavily taxed imports of computer hardware to foster its local tech industry. While this created domestic assembly companies, the protected firms never achieved world-class efficiency. Computer prices in Brazil remained far higher than global levels, lagging in technology. A comparison of computer prices showed U.S. prices falling much faster than Brazilian prices in the 1980s, and the gap never closed. In fact, Brazil never became competitive in PC without protection, and eventually the policy was reversed. This failure of infant industry protection taught a cautionary lesson. Protection must be coupled with a path to improve and eventually face competition, or the infant never grows up. Other countries have similarly seen protected industries remain chronically uncompetitive, often at great cost to consumers who pay higher prices and to other industries that use those products. Krugman and other economists in the 1980s explored strategic trade policy, which is related to infant industry but focused on industries that are oligopolistic, a few large competitors globally, and have high R&D or scale economies like aircraft manufacturing, semiconductors, etc. The famous example is the Boeing vs. Airbus scenario. In a market that can only support one or two major firms, a government might use tariffs or, more directly, subsidies to ensure its national firm gains the upper hand. The Brander-Spencer model showed that an export subsidy could allow a domestic firm to preempt a foreign rival in such an industry, capturing monopoly profits that benefit the home country. In theory, a well-timed intervention in an industry like commercial aircraft manufacturing could yield national welfare gains by securing a larger share of global industry profits for the home country, essentially boosting national income at the expense of other countries, a beggar thy neighbor outcome. This is a positive aspect from the perspective of the country using the policy, though obviously not a benefit in the cooperative global sense. Paul Krugman, who helped popularize these ideas, noted that strategic trade policy is powerful but also perilous. He characterized such policies as beggar thy neighbor. They can enrich the home country only by essentially taking market share or profits from others. If every nation tries the same strategy, they can cancel each other out or lead to trade conflicts. Moreover, strategic interventions require precise information and timing. The government needs to identify the right industry, one with the potential for large-scale economies and profits, and not overshoot with support. Krugman himself cautioned that the Brander-Spencer result does not establish a general policy prescription for subsidies or protection, highlighting that it's very sensitive to assumptions and hard to apply in practice. Many industries won't meet the criteria, and picking winners ex ante is difficult. If applied to the wrong industry, tariffs can backfire. The protection just locks resources into a sector with no hope of true comparative advantage. Another potential long-term benefit sometimes cited is that tariffs can be used to address market failures or externalities. For example, if an industry has positive spillovers to the rest of the economy like learning, by doing that spreads to other firms, or if it's critical for national security or supply chain resilience, protecting that industry could yield broader benefits not captured by private market prices. A tariff can be a second best policy to encourage production in such sectors. A direct subsidy might be more efficient, but tariffs are sometimes the more politically feasible tool. National security is often invoked. A country might impose tariffs on defense-related goods to ensure it has domestic production capability in case of conflict, for instance. Tariffs on military equipment or strategic materials. While the economics in peacetime might favor importing those items more cheaply, the argument is that the insurance value of having a domestic industry justifies the cost. Indeed, U.S. law allows tariffs for national security reasons. Section 232, tariffs on steel/aluminum were justified this way. These benefits are hard to quantify, but are part of the policy calculus beyond straightforward efficiency. In summary, tariffs can have positive effects when used in a targeted, temporary, and strategic manner. They may nurture infant industries, counter certain unfair trade practices, or support sectors with large future potential or critical importance. The success stories of East Asian economies and even the early United States suggest that protective measures, coupled with strong industrial policies, education, and infrastructure investments, can catalyze development. However, the conditions for success are stringent. Tariffs work best as part of a broader strategy, not as a stand-alone solution. And they must eventually be eased to expose firms to competition. Otherwise, protection can breed inefficiency. The risks of using tariffs for long-term gains include fostering monopolies or vested interests that resist competition, burdening consumers for too long, and provoking retaliatory actions from trade partners that negate the gains. As Krugman and others have warned, while theoretically one can justify tariffs in special cases, practically it is challenging to get those policies right and not have them captured by politics or prolonged beyond their useful life. To balance the theory with real-world outcomes, we review evidence from recent U.S. tariff actions and examples from other countries. These cases illustrate the tangible costs and benefits of tariffs in practice. In 2018, the United States under President Trump imposed significant tariffs for the first time in decades, marking a sharp turn from prior trade policy. Key measures included a 25% tariff on steel imports and 10% on aluminum, justified by national security concerns, and Section 301 tariffs on roughly $300+ billion of imports from China, starting at 10%, later 25% on many items, in retaliation for China's trade practices. The stated goals were to revive U.S. industries like steel and pressure China to change policies. What do the results show? Price increases and consumer costs. Studies consistently found that the tariffs led to higher prices for American consumers and businesses. The U.S. International Trade Commission, USIC, reported that import prices rose nearly 1-for-1 with the tariffs, e.g., prices of imported steel jumped 22% and aluminum 8% versus pre-tariff trends. A Tax Foundation review of several studies concluded U.S. consumers and firms bore the brunt of the tariffs' costs. In many cases, there was almost full pass-through of tariffs into domestic prices. For example, a University of Chicago study found that after tariffs on washing machines were imposed, the retail price of laundry appliances climbed by about 12%. Machines cost $86 more, and even dryers not tariffed rose $92 as sellers bundled products. That tariff raised about $82 million in government revenue, but cost U.S. consumers roughly $1. $5 billion, a stark illustration of consumers paying 18 times more in higher prices than the government received in tariff revenue. The difference went partly to domestic producers, e.g., Whirlpool enjoyed higher profit margins, and largely was a deadweight loss to consumers. Across all affected imports, researchers Amiti et al. 2020 and Fajgelbaum et al. 2020 found nearly 100% of the import tax was passed to U.S. buyers. Foreign exporters did not significantly cut prices. Impacts on U.S. industry. The protected industries saw mixed results. U.S. steel producers initially benefited, capacity utilization rose, and profits improved thanks to higher prices. However, since domestic demand was not significantly higher and global overcapacity remained, the boost was temporary. Some smaller steel mills did restart, but overall employment in steel barely grew. Meanwhile, steel-using industries from auto manufacturing to construction faced substantially higher input costs. Studies by the Peterson Institute and others estimated that far more jobs were lost in steel-using sectors than jobs gained in steel production, as much as 75,000 jobs lost in larger economy versus perhaps 8,700 jobs created or saved in steel. According to one analysis, a common finding was that each steel job saved by tariffs cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in consumer costs. Similarly, tariffs on Chinese intermediate goods hit U.S. manufacturing firms that relied on those inputs, in some cases leading to higher production costs and suppressed job growth in those downstream industries. On the other hand, a few targeted sectors like domestic appliance manufacturing did expand employment modestly after tariffs shielded them from import competition, but at a very high cost per job. One calculation for the washing machine, tariffs put the cost at over $800,000 per job saved, once you factor in price hikes to consumers. Macroeconomic effects. At the aggregate level, the tariffs of 2018-2019 were sizable enough to have measurable macro impacts, though not catastrophic. The Tax Foundation's General Equilibrium Model estimated the Trump-era tariffs and foreign retaliation effectively reduced U.S. long-run GDP by about 0.2% and cost around 142,000 full-time equivalent jobs relative to a no-tariff baseline. Other studies similarly found a small drag on U.S. growth. For instance, IMF researchers, Fursery et al. 2019, found that increases in tariff rates tend to modestly lower GDP and raise unemployment over a few years. By 2019, manufacturing output and investment in the U.S. had slowed partly due to trade policy uncertainty and higher input costs. The tariffs also prompted efficient supply chain reallocation. Many importers shifted sourcing from China to other countries like Vietnam or Mexico to avoid tariffs. While this mitigated some direct costs, it introduced new inefficiencies, higher transport costs, suboptimal suppliers. As for inflation, Federal Reserve economists estimated the tariff measures contributed on the order of 0.3 percentage points to core inflation in 2018-2019, noticeable, but not the primary driver of inflation at the time, which was low overall. Once in place, the tariffs mainly resulted in a level shift in prices for affected goods rather than continuously accelerating inflation. Trade balances and revenue. Tariff advocates hoped to reduce the U.S. trade deficit and bring back manufacturing. In reality, the overall trade deficit did not improve, it actually widened in 2018-2019, as strong U.S. growth pulled in imports and exports fell in retaliation. Hit sectors. Tariff revenue did increase. The U.S. Treasury collected roughly $80 billion/year in customs duties during 2019-2020, up from around $35-40 billion pre-tariffs. However, this was still a small fraction of U.S. fiscal needs. Tariffs went from 1% to 2% of federal revenue. Moreover, a large portion of the tariff revenue was spent offsetting losses to sectors hurt by retaliation. For example, over $28 billion was paid to farmers to compensate for export losses when China retaliated against U.S. agriculture. So, the net fiscal gain was minor. Overall, the Trump-era case highlights the trade-offs of tariffs. They did provide relief and higher prices to certain industries, steel, appliances, solar panel makers, etc., and perhaps bolstered those sectors in the short term, but the costs to consumers and other businesses were substantial, and economy-wide the tariffs functioned as an inefficient tax that likely dampened growth modestly. By 2021-2022, U.S. inflation spiked for other reasons like supply shocks and monetary factors, and there were debates about whether removing the tariffs could help. The consensus from studies was that removing the remaining tariffs on Chinese goods could reduce CPI by about 0.3 percentage points, a small but non-trivial effect. As of 2024, most of those tariffs remain in place, and they continue to be a point of discussion in U.S. trade policy, weighing the geopolitical goals versus the economic costs. Many countries have used tariffs as part of their industrialization strategy. We examine a few notable examples outside what was previously mentioned. Tariffs for revenue in developing nations. In many poorer countries, more mundane use of tariffs has been simply to collect revenue. Countries with weak tax administration find tariffs easier to collect at ports than income or sales taxes. This is an economic rationale for tariffs, though not an efficiency gain, just practicality. High reliance on tariff revenue can impede growth by keeping trade costs high. But if the alternative is no revenue for public investment, there's a short-term trade-off. Over time, most countries try to shift toward domestic taxes as institutions improve, because excessive if reliance has been linked with slower growth. For instance, numerous African countries reduced tariffs in the 2000s in favor of value-added taxes and saw increased trade volumes. The Peterson Institute notes that today it is mainly poor countries that use tariffs as a major revenue source, while advanced economies have moved away from them. Recent protective moves in advanced economies. It's worth noting that even developed countries occasionally resort to tariffs in strategic contexts. The European Union in 2023 imposed tariffs on imports of Chinese electric vehicles, aiming to protect European auto manufacturers from a surge of cheaper electric cars. This is a contemporary example of an infant industry argument in this case. Europe trying to shield its EV industry, although Europe's auto industry is not infant. Its electric segment is in transition and feels vulnerable to Chinese competition. The debate there mirrors many points discussed. Proponents argue it gives breathing room to European manufacturers to innovate and scale up EV production. Opponents worry it will raise car prices and invite retaliation, and that European consumers effectively subsidize automakers via higher prices. The outcome remains to be seen. Similarly, the U.S. in 2022 used tariffs and incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act to boost domestic renewable energy and battery industries, invoking both economic and security justifications, reducing dependence on China for critical clean energy components. These cases show that the appeal of tariffs for strategic reasons persists, even in economies that generally favor free trade. From the above analysis, a few empirical patterns emerge. Tariffs almost always raise prices for consumers in the imposing country, with few exceptions. Foreign producers seldom lower their prices enough to offset a tariff, meaning domestic prices reflect the tax. This has been seen in the U.S.-China trade war, historical tariff episodes, and numerous product-specific studies. The benefits of tariffs, jobs, or profits saved in the protected industry are typically concentrated and visible, while the costs, slightly higher prices for millions of consumers, diffuse job losses in other sectors are spread out. This asymmetry often makes tariffs politically attractive despite net economic costs. Tariffs can be effective in fostering domestic industries when carefully applied as part of a broader development strategy, as in East Asia. But without competition and sunset plans, they risk entrenching uncompetitive firms, as seen in some Latin American attempts. The success stories often involved export competition as the true test. Modern global supply chains complicate the picture. Tariffs on intermediate goods can boomerang and hurt a country's own exporters. The 2018 U.S. tariffs showed how integrated the economy is. Tariffs on Chinese components hurt American manufacturers, and retaliation hurt farmers. In a globalized economy, protection for one sector often means pain for another within the same country. There is evidence that over the long run, more open economies tend to have higher productivity and growth, whereas economies with high tariff barriers tend to lag. For example, an IMF study, Fursery et al., found that a tariff increase of 1 percentage point reduces output by about 0.4% after a few years on average. Conversely, episodes of trade liberalization, tariff cuts, are often linked to faster growth and lower prices. India's 1991 reforms, China's WTO entry, etc. This doesn't prove causation in every case, but it aligns with the view that the efficiency gains from free trade usually outweigh the loss of protection. In conclusion, tariffs are a double-edged sword in economic policy. On one side, they can provide short-term protection and a policy lever to nurture industries, retaliate against unfair trade, or achieve non-economic goals like national security. Historical and contemporary examples show that tariffs, used judiciously, have sometimes contributed to building competitive industries, particularly when coupled with broader industrial policies and when the protection is temporary. The infant industry argument and new trade theory demonstrate that under specific conditions, learning curves, scale economies, oligopolies, a tariff or subsidy can theoretically yield long-term national gains. These potential benefits make tariffs attractive to policymakers looking to develop certain sectors or to shelter domestic jobs from global competition. On the other side, the economic costs of tariffs are well documented. Tariffs act as a tax on consumers and importing firms, raising prices and creating deadweight losses as some mutually beneficial trade is foregone. They tend to be an inefficient way to raise revenue or protect jobs, often costing consumers many times the income saved in the protected industry. By distorting prices, tariffs can lead to resource misallocation, where society's labor and capital produce things at higher cost domestically rather than sourcing them more cheaply. Over time, this can reduce productivity and growth. Tariffs can also provoke inflationary pressures in the short term by pushing up prices of goods and invite retaliation internationally, which may hurt exporters and global economic stability. Compared to broad-based taxes, tariffs usually impose a larger economic drag for each dollar of revenue raised, and their burdens fall disproportionately on certain consumers and downstream industries. For the United States, which today is a relatively open economy, the consensus of economists is that recent tariff increases have hurt more than helped in net terms. Consumers and many businesses bore higher costs, while gains, like a brief revival in steel output, were limited and possibly unsustainable without ongoing protection. At the same time, the U.S. experience reminds us that policy objectives are not only about GDP. Concerns about trade fairness, strategic supply chains, or political preferences have kept tariffs on the agenda. Going forward, the challenge for policymakers is to balance these considerations, using tariffs sparingly and strategically, if at all, and prioritizing alternative measures like direct subsidies for innovation, adjustment assistance for workers, or international agreements to achieve similar ends with less economic distortion. In conclusion, tariffs come with significant economic costs, inefficiency, and higher prices, which generally outweigh their benefits for mature economies under most circumstances. However, in certain contexts developing new industries, addressing strategic needs, or bargaining in trade negotiations, tariffs can play a role if implemented carefully and temporarily. An unbiased look at theory and evidence suggests that while tariffs can protect and even create specific jobs or industries in the short run, the long-run prosperity of an economy is better served by open competition complemented by smart industrial policies rather than by permanent tariff barriers. As history and empirical studies show, nations that have prospered tend to use tariffs as a targeted tool rather than a broad policy platform, mindful of the delicate trade-offs involved.